So good afternoon, everyone. For I think our fourth pilot meeting in our series. So my name is Alex Frangi, and I'm professor at the University of Manchester, and I'd like to welcome you to the UK Centre of Excellence on In-Silico Regulatory Science and Innovation, or UK CEiRSI for short. And this is a series of training webinars that are proudly supported by Innovate UK, the Medical Research Council, or MRC, and the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA. And as the UK's first centre of its kind, we pioneer the use of in-silico methods to enhance regulatory science and innovation. And our webinars usually delve into the latest advancement, best practices, or applications of in-silico approaches, with the idea that we foster collaboration and knowledge sharing among various stakeholders, with the idea of driving progress in healthcare and in medical research by adopting these techniques. So today, we are going to be diving into another use case or case study. I want to remind everybody that the objective of all of these case studies is to help to develop a better understanding between various technical stakeholders, and also between technical and non-technical stakeholders, of where these models can be credibly used, and also how do we assess credibility of these models. And to do that, we are exploring different scenarios of use with the idea that we develop that joint understanding. And although most part of the seminars tends to be largely technical in nature, because there is a substantial technical component, we do have as well colleagues from other disciplines, from social sciences, from economics, that I would be very happy as well, and very keen for them to put forward questions, or for you to put questions to some of them in terms of aspects that may emerge in these case studies as well. So that, without further ado, and with a big thanks to the team that you see here online, I want to hand over to Jeff, I think, who is going to be moderating the rest of the pilot.
All right, thank you, Alex. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen here and just get a confirmation from someone that it's coming through okay. All right. So welcome to this pilot number 8, total joint replacement devices, augmentation of national joint registry with data derived from in-silico trial insights. When we first started thinking about this pilot, this was the aim that we converged on. The aim was to establish credibility recommendations for in-silico trials of total joint replacement performance, enhancing device surveillance and regulatory decision-making through validation against registry data, enabling identification of device, patient, and surgical factors contributing to differential revision rates in the NJR that warrant appropriate field actions. So a lot of words. I think we stayed relatively true to this, but not completely. But it should be an interesting couple hours as we talk through the thought exercises that this group went through over the past couple months. So we have a long list of people who contributed here. I think I captured everyone here, but if I omitted anyone, I apologize. As you look through this list, one thing that I hope you recognize, and a bit to reinforce Alex's point, is the diversity of backgrounds of people. So I'm Jeff Bischoff. I work at Zimmer Biomet. We are a device manufacturer. You will see that there are a couple other folks on this group also from device manufacturers. But then you will see also a handful of other constituents, some from aspects of consulting, some from the software side, some from the regulatory side, some who primarily are in academic spheres. And so it's really the combination of these different perspectives that led to, I think, some pretty interesting discussions around this topic. And hopefully it will lead to an interesting discussion here over the next 2 hours. So before getting into the meat of this, I want to talk a little bit personally about why this topic is of interest to me, why I spent the last couple months with this team working on this. And so to start out, as mentioned, I work with Zimmer Biomet. We are a orthopedic device company looking at all different aspects of musculoskeletal health. Certainly one of the flagship devices within the space of musculoskeletal disease is total hip arthroplasty, right? And a solution for end stage osteoarthritis and other things within the hip. Fairly mature technology. We've gone through several generations of devices. They generally perform very well across a wide variety of situations. However, there still are failure modes of that follow total hip arthroplasty. And one of them that we will go into in a little bit more detail as one of our 2 case studies here is postoperative periprosthetic femoral fracture. And to be sure everyone understands what this is, we're not talking about fracture of the device itself. We are talking about fracture of the host femur, either intraoperatively or postoperatively. So it's a fracture of the femur itself, but that then can require various interventions, including revision surgery. And if we look at contemporary data, and I highlight here in red, Mark is going to talk in a little bit, well, in a bit more detail about this a little bit later on. But I want to spike out one aspect of this slide here. And so this slide is reporting on the incidence of periprosthetic fracture from the National Joint Registry. And you see on the left, there are a wide variety of systems. This isn't the full set of systems in the study. It's just a subset. And I picked out a couple at the top and a couple at the bottom, with all of these sorted by hazard ratio, where the lower the number, the better the performance of the device. And so you'll see in looking at this list that my company, we have products on both ends of the scale. So I look at these data, I see these data, and I want to offer a couple of reflections on this based on principles that were ingrained very early in my training as an engineer around this data. The first is when I was first entering university as an aspiring engineer, I was entering a super competitive university amongst a bunch of kids who were all used to being the best. And while we were being told within our group about what life was going to be like at the university, all of the parents who had dropped us off were in a separate room with the dean of the engineering school. And the dean of the engineering school essentially told all those parents of these super competitive kids, half of your kids are now below average. And that was shocking. According to the measuring stick at the university, half of your kids who used to being at the best are going to be below average. And so my reflection on this is no one wants that. And what you see here, right, everything that occurs prior to commercialization, everything from the manufacturing side, from the regulatory side, from clinicians who are involved in the R&D process, no one aspires to be at the end of this measuring stick. But very simply, half are below average, just like me and my colleagues entering university many years ago. Half are below average. So we see these data. We see this differential clinical performance between devices. And we ought to I contemplate what to do with this. And this leads to my second point. And it's encapsulated in the book title from a very popular professor when I was entering university. And the theme of this book is we need to learn, essentially. We need to learn. And if I put this within the context we're talking about here today, the methods that we used 3 decades ago should not be the methods we used last decade, should not be the methods we use right now. Our methods need to evolve as we grow in our understanding of clinical performance. And so entering today's webinar, I want to acknowledge from me a very clear bias that I have, which is my belief that in order to ferret out root causes behind the relatively coarse but super relevant signals that we get from national registries, in order to understand what are the device, what are the patient, what are the surgical factors that contribute to these differential outcomes. And then to use that knowledge, right, to design and implement with confidence the next generation of solutions, we need modeling and simulation. We need in silico clinical trials. This is why we're here. These are the methods of today. So with that being said, I'm going to jump to the end game of this webinar. These are the key points that we all hope you will leave with. The key message: validation of in silico clinical trials against registry data can enable a range of COUs, contexts of use. You've heard this word many times. You'll hear it a lot more today. That span both preclinical and clinical evidence generation. And within this point, why are we interested in doing this? Well, it comes from the belief that complementary evidence from both sources, from in silico clinical trials and clinical registry data, promote understanding beyond just equivalence. And through this, we can improve patient outcomes. What are we talking about here? We're talking about the combination of in silico clinical trials, right? Potentially preclinical simulation work and clinical registry data that provide a dynamic closed loop between preclinical and clinical evidence that can constantly be informing each other and evolving over time to improve our understanding, to improve solutions. How do we do this? How do we do this validation? Well, a key challenge is finally to demonstrate a sufficient level of association between what we're going to call here in silico endpoints, right? The outcomes from the simulation and the clinical endpoints, the sorts of signals that we gather from registries and other clinical data sources. With this association, demonstrate it to enable engineering, regulatory, and clinical decisions, right? We want to make decisions based on this with manageable model complexity. When can we do this? The reality is this is a very, very long pathway to use. And because of this, both the clinical and the commercial value proposition must be quite strong. We're going to lean into this point during the course of the next hour or two. And who can be impacted by this? I would put out on behalf of this team, everyone in the healthcare system can be impacted. We can impact patients. We can come out with better solutions. We can give more confidence to the providers. Everyone within the healthcare system can be impacted in a good way by this. So with that being said, the introduction is done. This is the view of the next couple hours. So I said we were mostly faithful to the initial aim of the pilot. In fact, we doubled up the intention. We came up with 2 case studies here. The first case study is on periprosthetic femoral fracture and total hip arthroplasty. We also have a second case study on cementless tibial tray loosening and total knee arthroplasty. Both of these involve understanding, looking at, internalizing data from the registry and using it to feed into an application of modeling and simulation. But the 2 contexts of use are quite a bit different, as you will see. So I would encourage you to think about the differences in the COUs as we talk through them. So in each of these case studies, we'll give a little bit of background. Not everyone here is an orthopedic fan, so I understand that. So we'll give a background, eventually leading to a context of use for really a thought experiment. So this whole exercise over the past couple months, the discussion here is around these 2 thought experiments. And at the end of each of these thought experiments, we're going to collectively share a number of considerations that we land on related to model credibility in this space. So when we think about registry data, when we think about developing a computational model to augment the registry data to enable us to make decisions, here are some things that we think about in terms of model credibility. For these 2 case studies, for the most part, this is going to be the committee of this pilot talking amongst each others, not just me. We'll have a couple of different people who are presenting some content, and then also a variety of other people who are offering some snippets of perspectives along the way. Once we get through those, then we will open this up to a more extensive discussion with everyone on the call, and would encourage you all to either put comments into the chat along the way, or be bold and offer the questions in words. And once we get done with that discussion, about 5 or 10 minutes prior to the end of this 2 hours, we are going to do something a little bit different from the other pilots, which is transition from these thought experiments to what we would propose for a real action for the CEiRSI around this space going forward. And so if you want to hear what that proposal is, well, then you need to hang around for the full 2 hours. So that's the carrot, and we hope it will be worth your while. So that's the agenda. With that being said, I am going to go on mute here, and we'll pass it off to Mark, who's going to introduce us to periprosthetic femoral fracture and total hip arthroplasty.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I'm just going to share my screen now. Can everybody see that?
Yes, looks good.
Great, thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is give an outline of what the epidemiological evidence tells us about periprosthetic fractures. So I'm a clinical orthopedic surgeon, and I'm also closely involved in a member of the leadership of the NJR, the National Joint Registry for England and Wales and various other places, that currently is the largest global joint replacement registry and has very detailed data. So firstly, I have no commercial conflicts of interest in any of the work that I do. I do receive some institutional grants, but these from government and charitable bodies, including the NJR. Periprosthetic fracture is a very clinically important problem because this is generally a more at-risk population. They're frailer, they're older than patients who don't sustain periprosthetic fractures on average, and they also have therefore much higher incidence of problems associated with having fractures, such, for example, the 90-day mortality is more than 5 times greater than for any other cause for reoperation, because a periprosthetic fracture in itself is a sign of frailty. Periprosthetic fracture survivors also have a much higher risk of re-revision than for any other indication as well, apart from perhaps infection. So just to give you a little bit more background about the bone of the proximal femur, or the thigh bone, which is what we're talking about here. Bone naturally changes its density and mass, if you like, throughout the life course. It goes up as you get up to about the age of 30, it increases. And then after the age of 30, it shows a slow decline, which accelerates in older life, both in males and in females. And once you get below a certain bone mass, your fracture risk is increased significantly. And this is in native bones without a joint replacement in. And the same is most definitely true for the femur that has an implant in it. We also know that prosthesis design itself affects bone mass around the hip joint. We can see, those of you who have familiarity with bone modeling and remodeling will see that this is basically a table showing the action loop for Wolff's law. So bone strength is a function of how much strain it's being subjected to and the response of the bone to that strain. And we can see that if you have a low strain, you decrease. With decreasing bone mass, you get remodeling that results in a drop in the quality of the bone, if you like. And up to a certain point, if you load a bone through a prosthesis, you get increasing bone mass up to a certain point where it becomes sort of pathological, which also can result in fracture. And you can see that these are essentially kind of illustrations of FEA type loading around different prosthesis designs. This is a composite beam cemented prosthesis, such as the Charnley, and you can see that tends to load more distally when the interface is fixed. And for taper slip type prostheses, these are ones where the cement implant interface is not bonded. They tend to load more proximally as a function of that taper slip. And there's an example of a double taper and a triple taper here. There are other design considerations as well as just the bonding and the implant cement interface, but I'll come on to those a little bit later. So that's a little bit of theory, and then in practice, this was a paper that I published with Alex some 8 years ago, which looked at a couple of randomized clinical trials, looking at different prosthesis designs and how they transmit load to the proximal femur in patients. And you can see that we see different patterns of bone gain and bone loss with different implant designs. This is a composite beam. These are both taper slip prostheses. This is a cementless fully coated prosthesis, and that's actually hip resurfacing. So hip resurfacings did actually lead to increased loading in the very proximal femur, but they led to prosthesis failure for other biological reasons. So we can see from this data that we do see changes in bone mass around prostheses, but how does that translate into periprosthetic fracture, postoperative periprosthetic fracture risk? Well, this is some work that we published in a couple of journals quite recently, where we looked at over 1 million primary joint replacements in the NJR and linked that to hospital episode statistics in public hospitals in England. And we matched the patients to look at periprosthetic fracture events. And the reason that we link these two data sets is because the NJR tells us about primary operations and revision procedures. It doesn't tell us about periprosthetic fractures that get treated by other methods, primarily by fixation. And we don't, until we did this work, we didn't have an appreciation of just how many fractures are actually fixed rather than being revised. But from a patient's perspective, whether you fix it or revise it, it's still a major surgical insult to the patient that is associated with similar mortality and other complications. So they're very important whether they're fixed or revised. And in this combined data set, we had 800,000 patients' exposure cases. And we identified postoperative periprosthetic femoral fracture events by OPCS code, ICD-10 codes, ICD-9 codes. And so we matched the side of the prosthesis that was relevant. And they had to have obviously had a primary joint replacement before the fracture episode. If the joint replacement was after the fracture episode, then we excluded them. And if we look just at what happens in terms of the number of periprosthetic fracture events that occur after a primary, we have the most rapid increase is in the first month or two, first few months after surgery, and then we hit a plateau, and then in later life the risk starts to accelerate again, so that by about 15 years we have an incidence rate of a couple of % of patients. We look at the characteristics of the patients. We see that patients who have a periprosthetic fracture tend to be older than the patients who don't have a periprosthetic fracture. You can see 73 versus 69. They tend also to have a higher level of comorbidities. You can see 24% versus 18% here for ASA grade 3. This is a measure of comorbidity, and ASA grade 4, again, higher than the fit and healthy patients. And there also tends to be an increase in indications for things other than primary osteoarthritis. If we look here at this data, this isn't meant to show you the risk as a proportion of the number of implants. It's actually just meant to show you the total number of counts and what proportion get fixed in England and Wales versus what proportion in England, sorry, alone, versus what proportion get revised, i.e. the old implant taken out and a new one put in. So ignore the total counts, because the number of cemented implants that are put in the UK historically far outweighs the number of cementless implants that are put in. As I say, it's just the proportions that you should look at. And if we look at this, as a proportion of fractures, rather more cementless implants get revised and rather more cemented implants get fixed. So when you look at the actual incidence and you're thinking only of revision, you get this skewed impression that that cementless fractures, cementless prostheses, give rise to a fracture much more commonly than cemented prostheses if you don't take into account the number that are actually fixed and therefore are not present in the NJR revision figures. And then if we look at, again, don't worry about the absolute numbers, because that depends on the proportion that are put in. But if you look at the ratios of fixed to revised, we've now split out the cemented ones into composite beam versus taper slip prostheses. And we can see that within both, a rather greater proportion tend to get fixed than tend to get revised. And again, the comparison is with the cementlesses, for which a greater proportion tend to get revised. And if we look now at time scale following surgery, and if you add these both up, they add up to about 100% in total. But you can see here the numbers that get fixed and the numbers that get revised. We can see for all classes of prosthesis, the highest risk is early. And then for cementless prostheses, the risk drops very rapidly towards or near baseline by the end of the first year. With polished taper slip prostheses, the earlier incidence is lower, but it extends out for a prolonged period. And with composite beam prostheses, again, the proportion is low, but the hazard continues to a greater extent over time than it does for the cementless prostheses. So we talked about the risk factors and patient-related factors earlier on, but there are a few things to take home, things like individuals with osteoporosis, those that have had a previous fragility fracture, those that are diabetic, those that have alcohol history, a high history of falls, older patients, they all tend to have a higher risk of periprosthetic fractures. And then there are some surgical factors as well that contribute to a degree to prosthetic fracture risk. This one's a curious one, unilateral hip replacement versus staged bilateral. That's probably a artifact of confounding by indication, because if you're having staged bilateral hip replacements, you've got to be fit enough to get to the second of the bilateral hip replacements to be fit for it. And that likely indicates that you're a healthier person than if you only had a single prosthesis. But maybe not read too much into that, because there may be a confounding by indication element here. And again, we're just showing the same data here, looking at age over 70 patients. The lowest risk seems to be in patients with composite beam prostheses, and polished taper slip have a higher incidence together with the cementless prostheses. Patients with femoral neck fracture, the cementless prosthesis, the incidence rate seems to be lower here, but that may be a function of the fact that we put very we put relatively few of them into patients with femoral neck fractures, and they tend to get a polished taper strip prosthesis. This is a slightly different slide to the one that Jeff showed earlier on. Here, just for you've seen for the total patient cohort, the distribution of hazard ratios for different prostheses. I'm showing here for a bit of novel information, those with non-osteoarthritic hip disease, but the principles are basically the same. If we take the Exeter V40 as the reference prosthesis, because it's the most commonly used femoral implant in England at the moment, over the last 22 years, you can see the overall risk with the composite beam prosthesis, the Charnley, it is associated with a significantly lower risk, and then different types of other stems, we can see some increasing risk here. But the point to note about some of the cementless prostheses is if you have a collar on a fully coated cementless prosthesis, your risk is certainly no higher than with the Exeter tapered polished stem. However, other factors are also at play. So you can see Coral College here has a pretty much similar to the Exeter, whereas a Coral collarless has an increased risk. And then it depends also what the implant is made of. So here's the CPT, which is made of cobalt chrome, which has a higher risk as well. So there are clearly implant factors that are of very significant relevance in the subsequent risk of postoperative periprosthetic fracture. So just to summarize, postoperative periprosthetic fracture is a very common cause of failure, cause for reoperation, whether it's revision or fixation. We can use NHS data to identify these periprosthetic fracture episodes that are fixed rather than, as well as those that are revised. And we know patient factors are important, such as diabetes, neurological disease, alcohol use, fragility fracture, osteoporosis, and recurrent falls. But there are also important stem design factors which affect fracture risk. And these are not only the material that the prosthesis is made of, whether it's cemented or not, but also other features such as whether it's got for a cementless prosthesis, whether it's got a collar or not. I think that's the end of my little segment, and I'll pass back to Jeff now.
All right, thank you, Mark. You may have to stop sharing on your side.
I'm just stopping my sharing now.
All right, perfect. All right, so is this coming through okay?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So thanks for that background, Mark. Now I want to get into what are the modeling applications here. So I have a couple slides to orient everyone to how we may use simulation in this space, and then we'll drill into a very specific context of use and have some discussion around credibility considerations for that context of use. So first, some background on how we might bring modeling simulation into this. I've pulled a couple images from a recent paper from Marco Vicciconti's group that I think are super relevant. A number of groups, Marco's group is not the only one, are looking at simulation of periprosthetic fracture. One very common attribute of these sorts of simulation studies is doing the virtual surgery, right? So you imagine you have a database of models of the femur, presumably derived from CT imaging. On each of these virtual models, we want to bring in a prosthesis similar to what is done surgically. So numerically, the way that we typically do this is we do what's called a Boolean subtraction between the instrumentation, which can include RASPs in the system and or the component. We use that to virtually hollow out, prepare the femoral component. and then place the prosthesis in there. And why I bring this up is the way that we do this preparation virtually can be very specific to the implant system, and not just to the implant design, but also the instrumentation. So if the instrumentation is a little bit different, then the ability of this Boolean operation to accurately represent what is done surgically may vary. And also based on the design, once we place it into the canal virtually, based on the interaction of the component with the bone, it can trigger malalignment of the stem, which can vary from component type to component type. So keep those concepts in mind as we get into the discussion on credibility. Another point I want to bring out from this type of simulation is finally we want to predict fracture, right? That's what we're after, periprosthetic fracture. And when we think about predicting fracture within simulation, we can be very complex with it. And so what this group did is you can actually mechanically identify where a fracture may initiate based on the local stress within the bone. There are then numerical methods to predict how that crack is going to propagate through the bone. You can then predict when that crack will fully propagate through to the external cortex, at which point presumably it may be observable within a clinical environment. This is one way that we may predict the incidence of fracture, but it's not the only way. There are also ideas about looking at stress within the bone itself prior to any fracture initiation. This one could in fact be more complex by including algorithms of bone remodeling, as Mark had mentioned, which we know happens around total hips. A variety of ways to do this. My point for bringing this up, though, is eventually we want to have a coupling between whatever the output is from the simulation here, the in silico endpoint, and the clinical endpoint that we're pulling from the registry, which may be a revision rate, it may be something else. So keep these ideas in mind when you're thinking about what a modeling approach may be for addressing periprosthetic fracture. Okay, so now let's get into the thought experiment. So first, a bit of the restatement of the background. So we've talked about periprosthetic femoral fracture. Won't say anything there, but the second point is super relevant. That within this space of medical devices, we don't have any consensus approach to how to address this risk preclinically. So we can use simulation, as you would have seen. We can come up with benchtop testing. Some do that. We can look at cadaveric testing. Some do that. But the fact is we don't have a consensus state-of-the-art approach yet for assessing the risk of PFF preclinically. With that in mind, can we fill that void with an in silico clinical trial, right? Can we come up with a standardized in silico clinical trial as an analytical test bed that can span the range of clinical scenarios, provide results that are consistent with the real world, and serve as a screening tool for new devices that we're trying to bring to the market? So with that background, then we have a question of interest. Many of the pilots have talked about question of interest. This is the first part of going through the ASME VNV 40 credibility assessment. What is the question of interest? So the question of interest here, what are the essential methodological attributes of an in silico clinical trial for assessing the risk of PFF following total hip arthroplasty that can replace cadaveric testing for preclinical screening of new designs? And when I talk about methodological attributes, we're thinking about all the different things that Mark mentioned in reviewing the epidemiology. So what are the demographic factors? What are the use conditions? What are morphological considerations around the shape of the femur? What are surgical considerations? All these different things that contribute to the differential results within the registry. We want to include all those in a fair way within this in silico clinical trial, right? Indeed, that's the value of the in silico clinical trial. We can take into account all of these variables. So that's the question of interest. And then if we take it one step further to the context of use, the ISCT will be developed to evaluate the risk of PFF to support advancement in design, planning, and technique. We want to use the ISCT as a definitive preclinical evaluation to ensure non-inferiority to established clinical benchmarks as a replacement for sawbones and cadaveric benchtop testing. And the last one is that with demonstration of non-inferiority, no pre-market clinical data will be required to demonstrate that the risk of late-term PFF has been sufficiently mitigated. Okay, so this is the COU that we brainstormed around. I think all of you may look at this differently. You may say this is too aggressive of a context of use, but this is the one that we chewed on for a couple months. And I will say that a key point of this, the way that this wording is, when we think about context of use, you have to evaluate model influence, right? What is the influence of the results from the ISCT relative to other forms of evidence? The intention here is that this is high influence. We're really relying on the results in the In-Silico clinical trial to be the definitive data to go to launch. So what are some of the model credibility considerations? So I'm going to go through these all and then open up to all the others on the group to offer some perspectives on these points. So the first one, when we think about credibility, we are basically introducing the NJR as the comparator, right? Rather than a cadaveric test, rather than benchtop testing, we're now using the registry as the gold standard. This is the ground truth that we're trying to replicate with the model. And so some of the concerns about using this, first one, quantity of the test samples. This is a central part of the credibility assessment. How many clinical observations of fracture in the registry are sufficient, and what is the confidence in that number? So registries might be large, but in terms of acting as a comparator, it's only the observations of fracture that we can use to inform the comparator. And as Mark mentioned, there is some fuzziness around that number. Yes, we have revision rates, but fractures also may be addressed in other sorts of ways. So that's one consideration. Another consideration is the sample and comparator conditions are not consistently and precisely known. When we think about a benchtop comparator, we think about it's super controlled, super measured. This is not the case when we're dealing with registry data. There's some things that we may be able to measure. We may have some very coarse metadata around the patient population. In some cases, we may be able to extract some imaging information, although there are some challenges to doing that. But there are others where we really don't know at all. We don't know the use conditions for patients. We don't know what patients are going through in their daily life. And so we need to make assumptions around this sort of thing. So some of those critical conditions are not known. And the third point is that the registry results are really system level. So we have the implant, we have the patient, we have the surgery, we have all these things coming together leading to this event, but we really don't know, right, what is the singular factor or factors that led to that event. That's something that we need to puzzle over. The second point is around applicability. So we have but they reflect results only for a subset of their national. And they're also only in play for existing devices. And if you think back to the context of use, right, it's great to understand existing devices. The COU is really to evaluate new devices that don't have yet a footprint within the registry. So that's a consideration around applicability. The third one is the credibility assessment can be a living process, right? So through post-market surveillance, the clinical relevance of the In-Silico clinical trial should be perpetually and appropriately under scrutiny. This isn't a one-time deal to establish credibility. Ideally, it's something that we are continuously monitoring. We're continuously looking at results of devices. We're continuously looking at those through the lens of the registry to make sure that the differential performance from the ISCT is consistent with the differential performance from the registry. And the last one is a brief comment around risk. Think back to the COU, right? What we are proposing is a standardized population-based In-Silico clinical trial that manufacturers like me, like others on this call, can use to good end. Who owns the risk in that case? Is it the manufacturer who's using that method, or is it the organization that is coming up with this standardized approach? And so that's something that has to be very carefully thought about. So at this point, I am going to pause here, and I would invite others on the group here to offer perspectives on any of these points here for a few minutes. Yeah, Renee, please go ahead.
Jeff, thank you so much, and Mark, also thank you for presenting. I think for the first point, what is the quantity of test samples? So what do we actually need? From a regulatory perspective, I think it is always related to clinical practice. So what do we actually see? What do clinicians say? How often do things occur? I mean, in this case, how often do these fractures occur? How is this also linked to the risk management process? So how many data do we actually need to say we can accept this risk? So I think how many observations we need, I think we have to be careful also not to overestimate. So if we do too many testings, maybe this will also dilute the things we have in reality. So we won't be able to display with CMNS also real world data because they're not as lean as we wish. Real world data are very also inconsistent in a way. And I think with CMS, it might also, so if we have too large test samples, it might dilute the reality.
Thanks, Renee. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, so on this point about the critical sample and or comparator conditions are not consistently and precisely known, this is something, of course, we'll talk about in the next case study, but as it relates to all of this and considering registry data, especially considering running an ISCT off of inspired by or leveraging information from real-world data, registries, et cetera, I think it's really important for us collectively, whatever the system is going to be, to understand the sensitivity of the results to various conditions. So the reason why I think that's particularly important is you don't necessarily need to get every precise detail of every patient into a model in order to predict whatever the quantity of interest or metric of interest is. Instead, it's really important that we understand what are the key factors, what are the key parameters, what can we do to establish the most important factors, and then really study what their variability is, because we're not going to have precise information. So let's use our effort to really nail down the things that are going to most drive the results, and really try to leverage and collect that data as best we possibly can.
Thanks, Steve. Mark, go ahead.
So thanks, Jeff. I think in related to this comparator question, it's very important to actually have a clear handle on what the denominator is as well as the numerator. So if you've got 10 fracture cases that you're modeling, if that is based on 40,000 implantations, then you can say, actually, this device is really good and there's very little periprosthetic fracture risk. If that is based on a couple of hundred implantations, then you've got a very, very different periprosthetic fracture problem. So I think that whole context needs to be understood. So you almost want to model, and presumably we're wanting to model with the aim of reducing the actual incidence of periprosthetic fractures. We want to model the good as well as the bad in terms of overall prosthesis performance and learn from the good as well as the bad.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think that point also is going to come up in the second case study as well. We'll lean into that one a little bit more. Mike.
Yeah, I think my comment in there, kind of thinking towards this as well, chimes into with what Mark covered in the presentation, and as well as what Steve was saying about around the systems level aspects of this as well. So we know that there are some combinations of implants that perform very differently based on what head, what cup, what approach is used. I think that's one of the things at the moment that the registry data is starting to pull out, but it's almost like an additional layer within that data that we need to understand before we can to a certain extent credibly use these models to assess fracture. I mean, the other side of that, the models give a great platform for that, right? Because we can assess all of these different combinations without the need of to be doing studies in clinic. So yeah, that's kind of my view to a certain extent on the systems level complexities associated with this.
Thanks, Mike. Payman, go ahead.
Just one comment. If we look at the and it was a lot of hypotheses was explored here, right? In what could be the cause, all the different metrics, and then there was some discussion on, say, stress-based, a context of use that's stress-based, and then the question is, how do we make sure that there's no bias in the system, right? So if, as we specified, we're going to select patients who experienced fracture, and then we build we build models around that assumption, which is the true positive. So and then on is but do we need to consider patients who actually had experienced fracture? Maybe the same stress levels are there, but nothing happened to them, right? So we need to consider those in the context of use, and then because that would challenge some of the assumptions and the hypothesis that comes out of this computational or in silico clinical trial outputs.
Yep, agreed. Thanks, Payman. Okay, so all on this call, I would encourage you to keep these points in mind. Think about them. If you have thoughts, either log that question down or throw it into chat. We are going to come back to these within the discussion later on. But for now, we're going to park these and go on to the second case study, which is framed around a different COU. So let me invite Steve to introduce that second case study.
Sounds great. Let's do it. All right. We looking at some knees here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so case study 2, we're talking about some total knee arthroplasty, particularly around cementless tibial tray loosening. So just super high level background here. The situation is such where somebody has an arthritic knee, as you see in the central image there. The replacement itself has a few different components to it. In particular, we're going to be talking about the tibial tray. So the bottom section, we'll see some pictures of it in a moment here. But the basic idea here is somebody's come in, they've got some damage to their knee. There's various aspects to these systems. We just talked a little bit about systems. We are focusing here in particular on the tibial tray. So when we look at these systems, here's some examples. Now, these are all commercially available. They're from some very large companies. You can see what I wanted to show here. Now, the central image, and actually the two on the right, the one on the left just shows the tray. The two on the right show the systems with various components. You see the liner, you see the femoral component, and down at the bottom, you see the tibial tray. In all of these designs, there are various features that are intended to mechanically lock the tray in place. Now, what we're thinking about for this particular case study, this scenario, is a situation where we have a cementless system. So for those who are not familiar, the concept of a cementless system is, as the name implies, you're not putting a cement into locking the tibial tray in with the bone. Instead, it's intended to, and you can see various features that are obviously engineered into the systems. You're going to have a mechanical fixation initially, and then you're going to have integration of the bone ingrowth into these porous structures that you see in the bottom here, in a way that tightens down the system and holds it in place. There are various mechanical features as well. You see different peg designs. So the little stubs are pegs. I'm sure there's different names for them, but essentially you see different designs for those. You also, the larger system or larger feature that is pointed down in all of these are keels or various other names for them. But basically you have a structure, an engineered structure that has a particular shape to it that is designed to provide that mechanical fixation. The reason why I wanted to show all three of these here, and there's obviously other designs as well, is that there's a number of different design features that are relevant to the performance of these products. You can see the different shapes of the various components. You can imagine, and in fact, in some of these circumstances, you can see some featuring with respect to the porous structures that the bone is intended to grow into. There's different manufacturing methods. There's different designs of that. There's a whole bunch of different engineering features that go into these systems that are relevant for the performance. So those are all parameters for the design. Additionally, as Jeff mentioned with respect to the hip replacement concept, there are surgical procedures as well. So for the implant of these tibial trays, there's various activities that are performed. There's basically a cut to remove the top of the tibia. There's guides and various surgical instruments that help to align that cut. There's various drilling activities that are undertaken. There is the press fit of the cementless tray into the bone. There's a whole bunch of different things that go on from a surgical perspective. I think both of those concepts are really important. We don't need to deal with the details at this point, but just this idea that you have engineering features, you have surgical properties or surgical procedural differences, and those are all going to connect together in terms of the performance. And we'll talk a little bit as well about patient level features in just a moment here. So we've got this concept, we've got this system. What we are going to look at next is a hypothetical scenario. So the case study that we're thinking about here is one where a new cementless knee system, similar in design to the prior ones, and I want to point out the prior ones are all commercially available, they're good, whatever. We're not trying to comment on the existing systems. Instead, we're thinking specifically about this hypothetical new system that's been introduced. Now, the challenge here is that early registry data is showing that there is aseptic loosening of this tibia that's in excess of established devices that have long-term clinical history, such as the 3 that we saw before. So we've got a very high-level flowchart on the bottom here, where basically we're starting with this clinical signal. So, this is a new system that's been approved, that's on the market. And you've identified, or the registry data has identified, this increase in loosening. So we have to, of course, as we're thinking about this, go through a root cause analysis. We've got to figure out what's going on here, and we'll talk about some of the details of that. And obviously, modeling will come into that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But generally, you're thinking about this root cause analysis. From that root cause analysis, you then need to decide what are you going to do with the system, right? So from a business perspective, from a regulatory perspective, it's useful to have the information from a clinical perspective. You really want to know, what are you going to do? Are you going to, and we'll talk about some different courses of action in a moment here, but what are you going to do? The reason why that's particularly important, of course, is because, as the green and red arrows are rather coarsely trying to identify, your course of action is going to potentially lead to either a positive clinical outcome, so you identify the issue and you're able to solve it, and the aseptic loosening is mitigated, or you could have a negative clinical outcome where the course of action that you take is functionally not going to make a difference, or maybe it's going to make things worse, who knows? But you're going to have a negative clinical outcome. So you're going to have consequences for patients. And of course, on the downstream side of that, you're going to have corresponding business outcomes that are potentially going to be positive or negative, depending on your course of action. So we really all bring this back. You get this clinical signal. We've got to figure out, from a root cause analysis perspective, what are you going to do? How do you address this signal in this early registry data? Now, as we think about this hypothetical, there's a number of different course of action that can be taken. Those are going to lead to these business ramifications. So with respect to these course of actions, you could update the instructions for use. You could do some more work from a clinical education perspective if you think that that's the idea here. You could think about different surveillance studies that you'd want to do to get more information, sort of a pause on this to just try to get some more information there. You could go all the way to doing a recall where, essentially you pull this new product off the market and you suffer the consequences of that, or reap the benefits of not having further negative consequences. But anyway, you do a recall, which of course nobody really wants. And then from business perspective, at least, and then you could also just continue without taking any action. You could just take a wait and see approach. But fundamentally, we got to decide, what are we going to do here? And the question, of course, then becomes, how do we use modeling and simulation to help inform those approaches and the decision that we're going to take, or the action that we're going to take out of this? So with root cause analysis, of course, the very first thing we're going to do in any of these circumstances as the data starts coming in is we're going to do an initial data analysis of the information that's in the registry. So this is it's not modeling simulation. This is just, let's take a look at some data. Let's do some data analysis. throw it in ChatGPT or whatever, just kidding, to pull off what you think are going to be the appropriate factors. Now, in our hypothetical here, we've identified that these elevated risks are associated with increased BMI, the size of the femoral component, and the tibial slope, the posterior tibial slope. So those are some initial signals in the data. Now, that's all very interesting, but it still raises the question of what are you going to do in terms of your course of action with that information? So those are good data points. They don't really tell you what to do. They don't really give you enough information about exactly how to proceed. So what we're going to propose here is we're going to perform an ISCT course to further investigate these signals and see if we are able to substantiate these signals and try to get some more analysis and understanding of really what's going on here. What can we do to motivate changes to the things that we talked about in terms of patient indications, compatibilities of device, surgical techniques in terms of guides or maybe clinical education, rehabilitation strategies, et cetera. So fundamentally, we've got this initial signal. We don't quite know what to do with it. We're trying to get some more information, so we're going to run an ISCT, and that's going to hopefully inform us in terms of what our next steps are. So the question of interest here, as you see, is essentially that. Are these root causes sufficient for understanding the risk of this new design associated with loosening? And if so, what can we do to further explore and or manage or mitigate this clinical risk? That's the big picture thing that we're trying to address here as set up by this scenario. The context of use of our analyses are to run an ISCT to evaluate the impact of various things related to patients, surgical conditions, device variations, et cetera, on micromotion with the intent to provide a substantiation. So this is, I think, a really important concept here. So the data analysis, the initial data analysis has identified these factors. We want to provide a substantiation. We can't just use those factors to go off and tell clinicians what to do. We want to have some rationale behind this, right? So we're looking for our substantiation. If we get that substantiation, can we, together with that clinical data, motivate containment or mitigation efforts in order to bring those factors back down to an acceptable level? And if we can't substantiate it, then we really don't necessarily know what we're doing here. So we might need to suspend the clinical use. So we're really looking to use the model, use the ISCT here to substantiate some ideas about what's happening here to provide that indication for what to do next. Now, the model, this is just a figure from literature. I should put a reference on there. Shame on me. But the idea here is you have a tibial tray, much like something that Jeff was describing in terms of you have a model of a tibia. You've got a model of your tibial tray with the various design features that we discussed before. And then you do your surgical procedure, your simulated surgical procedure, you apply your loads, and then you look for various indicators of what the clinical scenario or the clinical occurrences, i.e. the loosening and micromotion. So this is an incredibly complex slide that I should have put some animation on, but the basic idea here is when we think about this and we think about modeling this, there's a number of different factors that we talked about some of them. The starred features here are ones that relate to the initial data analysis. There's a ton of other features, of course, that are going to go into the scope of this model. Things related to patient factors like maybe there's age, but there's activity level, there's level of loading, there's bone quality measurements, et cetera. From a surgical technique perspective, there's aspects of alignment, there's aspects of preparation, balancing, implant sizing, and so forth. Some of these features are going to be available in registry data. Some of them are not going to be available in registry data. We'll look at a table that shows some examples of types of information that are typical in joint registry data. Some of these things, we're just going to need to understand the sensitivity of the system to reasonable levels of each of these parameters, essentially. But fundamentally, what we want to do is we want to understand with the ISCT the effect of these risk factors on loosening metrics. Because we have, from this data analysis, the things that are starred here, we have these three ideas in terms of, or parameters that we think are important for this loosening, right? We want to confirm that those are actually important so that we can take our course of action. If there's other things that are playing a role, then maybe we don't have a good enough substantiation for our process here. Now, real quick, before we get into our credibility strategies, let's talk about this registry data here. A lot of words on here, but basically what we're looking at is the type of information you can expect to get out of a registry. There are, of course, different levels of information with different types of registries. There's going to be all sorts of caveats. There's all sorts of different implementations of registries, et cetera. But what you see on here are some representative metrics, at least, for certain registries. Now, very useful. There's some good information in there. For instance, you see in the surgical procedure, the type of fixation that's used. You might see something related to whether or not robotics are used. There's different aspects of patient characteristics with respect to BMI, et cetera. One thing you don't see in this is radiograph data. Right. So in some circumstances, you're going to have it in some specialized registries, and others you're not going to have it. So, that's a key feature here. You're also, of course, not going to see activity levels, so loading levels, et cetera. So there's a number of different things that are in the registry, and that's great. But there's a number of other things that from a modeling perspective, you'd really love to know, but you just unfortunately don't really have that information in the registry. And this is going to be a theme or a concept that we return to because we have to handle those uncertainties in that situation. But fundamentally, when we look at this, again, we have this scenario where there's some loosening. We need to try to get our substantiation. Two strategies that we came up with for this. And we're going to talk about the comparison between these essentially, and hopefully that'll provoke some conversation. The first strategy is what we call a multi-system comparison, where we're leveraging a predicate system. The second strategy is a single system comparison or a single system strategy where we're not leveraging a predicate. That's fundamentally the difference here. Let's just think about it from the perspective of the first strategy. It's a multi-system. We're using a predicate system and the information we have about that. The second strategy is one where we're not using a predicate. And let's talk about a little bit more on the details of those, and then the trade-offs that you have as you think about, am I going to use a predicate or not? With respect to the multi-system comparison, now this is the predicate one. Again, there's a lot of words on here, but the basic idea, we got a few different steps, three major steps we're going to talk about. There's obviously different avenues we can go down with each of these, but step 0 is essentially validation of these systems against preclinical testing data. None of these systems are getting on the market without having done some level of testing. We may want to change that in the future and use models and so forth, but we got to do some testing, right? So there is some testing data that's been produced as part of the regulatory submissions. We are going to validate the systems and our models of those, at least in those applications, using that preclinical data. So that's step 0. Step 1 then is, again, leveraging this predicate system. Let's just model the predicate system. Let's do what we can to understand and to validate the approach using the predicate system. And by approach, I mean the scope of the model, the way in which you're doing the surgical procedure, the way in which you're applying the loading, et cetera. So you're going to use the predicate system to establish all of that, to validate and to really ground your step 2, which is now conducting your analysis with the new system. So you've got an approach, a workflow, pipeline, whatever you want to call it. For the predicate system, you take your new system, you apply it in there, bing, bang, boom, you look for any kind of effect that you might have with the new system. So that's strategy 1, this multi-system comparison. Strategy 2 is a single system comparison. Now you're saying, maybe I don't have a predicate system. Maybe I don't want to spend the time, or I can't spend the time to do all this work on the predicate system. I need to just get to this new system and try to understand it. So I'm going to go with a single system comparison. You still have the ability to validate against preclinical testing data. Pros and cons of that, that we can certainly talk about, but you're still going to validate with this preclinical data. Step 1 here is essentially you're going to create your model. Now, again, we don't have the predicate system, so we need to create an ISCT and a surgical approach that is just using the new system. So we do that. Now, critically, step 2 here is creating this connection, or proposing or doing what you can essentially to make this connection between your in silico endpoints and your clinical endpoints. Now, the reason why we included it in this single system comparison, we didn't talk about it in the multi-system comparison, is because in this case, you don't have clinical validation from your predicate system. You need to hypothesize what metric you're going to get out of your models that is going to link to your clinical endpoint, because you don't have that validation from the predicate. So there's consequences of that, of course. We need to propose that, but that's an important step for this process. The last step here, Step 3 is running your blinded studies with this patient-specific models, using registry data, et cetera, to try to evaluate the consistency of your predictions from your model against the registry data. So you're essentially going to run examples out of your registry data. Some of them are going to have whatever your in silico endpoint is. Hopefully those ones that do have that endpoint that lines up with predicted loosening are the same patients that in the registry actually saw that loosening. And if that's the case, if you get that match between the model and the real thing, you got your substantiation and you can go from there and you can make your decisions. If you don't have that, you got to think a little bit harder. Now, as we think about this and as we think about the strategies, I do want to sort of zoom out a little bit here and think about the credibility, the categories of credibility evidence, because this is a really important point. Now, we've made this juxtaposition between a multi-system comparison and a single system comparison. We are going to use categories of credibility evidence to sort of weight these or think about the trade-offs. There are 8 categories. This is from the FDA guidance on credibility assessment. Some of these categories line up directly with ASME V&V 40 categories. Some of them are a little bit different. There's a list here. I'm not going to go through each one. We'll talk about some specifics in a moment. But this is an important way to sort of bucket your credibility evidence. Now, this is all at the beginning. This is when you're trying to establish credibility of the approach. You're going to do your credibility assessment activities, and then you're going to do your context of use simulations after you've established whatever level of credibility you're going to have. What I've done here in this case study is you'll see the 2 columns right in the middle are our different strategies. Strategy 1, multi-system. We've got our predicate. Strategy 2, single system, no predicate. I put some red boxes around some stuff that I want to point about. Category 5, this population-based validation results. We have that for the predicate system. We do not have that for the single system. So in the predicate system, the strategy 1, we are able to leverage our simulations of the predicate system to establish what we believe to really essentially validate on a population level the performance. And then we're going to use that and essentially use that same system with the new device. I have an important asterisk there that we'll talk about that speaks to applicability. So that's population level results. Plausibility is another differentiating factor here. With respect to plausibility, you have some plausibility in the multi-system strategy because you're leveraging, again, this predicate analysis. You have a little bit less probability or plausibility in the single system analysis because you're not able to link back to a predicate system. And the plausibility argument is essentially engineering judgment. Do you believe it, et cetera? So it's a little bit less weak for the multi-system. It's a little bit more weak for the single system. And then with respect to the calculation, verification, UQ stuff, the bottom line here, I put this in here. It's important. We're going to have uncertainty quantification when we do the context of use simulations after establishing credibility. But from the perspective of establishing credibility in this initial stage here, before we go to the context of use simulations, you have the predicate that you can leverage from an uncertainty quantification perspective. When you get to the single system model, it's much more difficult to decouple general uncertainty from just the variability in the way that you approach things when you just have a single system. So those are some really high level differences here. Now, when we look at this, and this is the last slide before we get into discussions, but when we look at this, I essentially have a handful of actually 3, so it's not even really a hand, but a handful of trade-offs that you need to think about when you're thinking about this multi-system approach where you're leveraging a predicate versus a single system approach where you're not able to. The first 2 tie together. I think you have a trade-off of the speed of your approach and direct cost or what have you, however you want to think about this, versus the breadth of your validation. There are plenty of benefits from a credibility perspective to doing the multi-system approach because you are leveraging the predicate, assuming the applicability, which we'll talk about next, is handled. You have this predicate system that you can lean on, right? The consequences of that, though, are that you are spending a lot of time doing your analysis on your predicate system before you get to the point where you're doing analysis on your new system. That time is an important trade-off because in this scenario we're talking about, you've got a system that is, from a business perspective, under question. So we need to be as fast as possible. So we have this trade-off between the speed and the breadth of validation. The applicability point, this middle one here on the right-hand side, is incredibly important. Using the predicate sounds great if the factors that you're including in the predicate as they relate to the clinical consequences are also applicable for the new design, right? So the with respect to micromotion, with respect to loosening, the way in which you treat the contact, for instance, between the tray and the bone needs to be appropriate for both devices. If it's only appropriate for the predicate, then it doesn't do you any benefit for the new system, etc. So applicability is incredibly important for the multi-system strategy. Conversely, with respect to the mapping between the in silico endpoints and the clinical endpoints, the single system strategy is very difficult because you need to have trust or faith. You have to have some justification for what that mapping function is going to be, because you're essentially saying, I'm going to look at some metric out of my model and I need to map that over to my clinical thing. And I got to hope that that mapping works out. Maybe you have some evidence for that outside of the models, maybe you don't. With the multi-system comparison, you can establish that mapping with the predicate model. So you have strong benefit from a multi-system strategy when you're thinking about this applicability of the endpoints between the in silico and the clinical. So we put all that together, and Jeff, I see there might be a couple of questions in the chat, but I think you've got the discussion points on your slide. So I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm going to kick it back over to you, Jeff, and you can share the discussion points.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so a couple points. Some of these I'm not going to belabor. The first one, Steve ended on this. This really focuses the question on the strength of the connection between the in silico endpoint and the clinical endpoints, right? The clinical endpoint is something like revision rate. The in silico endpoint could be any number of different things, right? We can pull out a lot of different metrics from simulations, and we have to figure out what that is. So that's a consideration here. A second one is model risk. So within this scenario, right, we have the initial clinical signal. That initial clinical signal has given us some ideas on what the root cause or causes may be for that clinical signal. We're going to use the ISCT to further ferret out the legitimacy of those root causes. And if that bears out, then presumably we can use a combination of the result in the in silico clinical and the emerging clinical data to inform what decision we should do on the device. So what is the risk, right? How do we evaluate the relative impact then of the results from the simulation with the clinical action? Very critical for assessing model influence. And of course, the higher the influence, the higher the risk, and then that propagates through to expectations on credibility. The third point is the blindedness of the comparison. And here, very simply, the modeling in this case study is inherently guided by clinical observations, right? Particularly for the single system credibility scenario that Steve was talking about. We have the clinical signal. We're trying to come up with a model that replicates that clinical signal. I don't think anyone would try and defend that that's a blinded, it's a validation activity. Does it have to be, right, in order to use a model to good end to address this clinical environment? The fourth point is applicability, as Steve mentioned. So the extension of whether the model is calibrated or validated, when we take that model and then we apply it to the system interest, we are going to probably have to make some changes. Devices are different, porous coatings are different, implantation approaches are different. The uncertainty in sizing, in placement, all these things are different between the systems. And so I think it's relatively naive to think that all the stuff that we dialed in appropriately for the initial system can apply without any further consideration to the new system. And the more we have to change those sorts of things, then we start to erode some of the applicability of what we've done. And the last one is just the reality of this scenario, which is in these sorts of situations, we need information now, right? We need to make a decision now for the good of the patients out there. We have a very acute need for an answer, but if we have not already anticipated that we could use an ISCT for this approach, if we are now trying to kickstart an ISCT to address this, we probably missed the boat, right? Because the practicality of developing this sort of ISCT, of demonstrating the credibility and then using it is probably on a different time scale altogether than what is needed in terms of rendering a decision on the device that's now in commercial use. Okay, so these are the 5 points. As with the first case study, I will take a pause here and open it up to others in the group to offer perspectives on any one of these different points. Mark, please go ahead.
So just thinking about the comparison between the in silico endpoint and the clinical endpoint, I'm just wondering for the periprosthetic fracture use case, whether in the in silico trial you can look at the ultimate failure load in the trial and compare that to the actual fracture hazard ratio of the implant in clinical use, and for the loosening, whether you can derive maximal total point motion or some other similar migratory characteristic in the clinical in silico data that would then map to observed clinical loosening hazard ratio for the predicate. And I'm thinking here of the use cases where you have a predicate, because if you haven't, then I think it becomes more challenging.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. To add to that, there may not be a singular answer. And I think that's part of the fuzziness of this whole approach, is that there could be several different in silico endpoints that seem to agree with the clinical endpoints. In the same way that when we try and postulate what the root causes are for either of these case studies, right? We have patient factors, we have device factors, we probably have some engineering ideas of what are important and what are not. We have evidence to support what is important and what is not. There may not be a singular combination that when we put them into the computational model generates results that are consistent with the clinical data. And so we have to wrestle with that lack of uniqueness, right, to the final solution that we've come up with. Yep, good point, Mark. Others? Mike, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the challenges around the extension of the calibration of the models and the kind of the nuances of the interfaces that are at play here. And that's a really important thing, particularly from an engineering context where, you know, if we're talking about blasting surfaces, well, different blasted surfaces, you know, they're not all the same, and they can have quite big effects in terms of performance. I guess one of the things that we always grapple with is not so much the population-based demographics, but it's then the inputs that you would then use to represent the population-based demographics and how we would deal with that from across the length scales, you know, in terms of biomechanics. So, you know, it's from a loosening perspective, the input biomechanics are going to be vital, but it's then how do you then come up with strata for different activity levels, different patient populations that would all go within these different needs. And you know, with that, the input biomechanics may be different then for the knee geometries that you're then assessing. So that then opens up a whole other paradigm of kind of complexities within how you actually, you know, what you actually feed into any ISCT for simulating those, you know, simulating micromotion in the end.
Yeah, good point. And I think to that one, we're kind of in a new world where we have the potential to bring in more use data, right? So particularly in the orthopedic space, I'm not sure how much this extends to other areas of medical devices, but there are a lot of patients now, right? We all have watches, we all have motion trackers, things like this, and so even if that data right now are not available within standard registry data sets, right? I could imagine a world where we start to have that coupling, and that presents then another a reduction of uncertainty, basically, because we know that, okay, these patients that did have an incidence of loosening of tibial tray or what have you, right? We can understand what those motion patterns are, and even before doing any simulation, right, potentially have some data to inform what are root causes. Okay, that apparently struck a chord. So Mark, please go, and Terry.
So just briefly, there are actually projects on the go in the NJR that are linking smart devices with registry data to look at activity levels and how they impact on implant survivorship. So that those linkages are certainly technically possible and practically possible with appropriate patient consent. And with imaging data, I know I'm going off tangent slightly here, that is a little bit more challenging in some ways. Imaging data is widely, is all available digitally, but the consent and governance arrangements around the sharing of imaging data are a little bit more problematic because they have to be pushed from the place where they were created rather than pulled by the registry in. So the rate limiting step is actually the institution that did the imaging to actually send it to you. And that creates a governance challenge that isn't anytime soon going to be changed, I think.
Thanks, Mark. Terry, go ahead.
Well, Rebecca Bryan was raising her hand way before me, so let me suggest that she's speaking first.
Okay, sorry, I did not see you. Rebecca, please go ahead.
That's okay. I was going to go on a slightly different point. So, Thierry, if you were following on from this, it makes sense.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was looking at the practicality, and I guess I was going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate on this and really say, okay, we all agree with the statement, all models are wrong, some are useful. So where do we draw that line? We are never going to be able to capture all the variables that we have in all of this. So where do we meet that point where it's okay and it's helpful and it's an indication? And then is there ever going to be a point where we can get a quantitative answer from these that we can really rely on without spending 15 years developing it?
Do you have an answer to that question as well?
No.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead, Alex. Yep.
Sorry, I'm trying to get my video out. So that is actually a really good point, Rebecca. And there is an apparently unrelated question, but I think is quite linked, which is why do we have most of the systems that we look at that are complex? Ultimately, most of the variability is explained, or most of the sensitivity is explained by a relatively small number of variables, right? So there's a couple of papers that I found recently that try to answer that question that I will put in a moment in the chat. But it seems to be that in very, very complex systems, there is always like very low dimensional, the interesting things happen in a much lower dimensional space. Let me put it that way. The problem is that a priori we don't know which those dimensions are from the very many that we have. So what I'm trying to say is that I think we need as much data as is available on the one side, but it is true that most of the times we can always reduce that to a handful. So I know that it's not fully answering the question, but I think it gives a bit of a perspective about the fact that I personally think that in the future, what we will need is to have registries or electronic health records or systems that are as comprehensive as we can, at least that all the data that we normally capture is not lost in the healthcare system. So we can start at least answering some of those questions of what do we actually need and what is irrelevant. And perhaps that will guide other things that we're not measuring now that we should be measuring. And it also will guide that certain things that we are measuring are less relevant.
Yeah, and to that point, I don't think we've tackled this issue straight on. Maybe early on, we don't we don't do well here to have complexity where we don't need complexity in the approach, right? I think we can all imagine that we can make these in silico clinical trials very, 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 very complex, right? Incorporate all sorts of variables, whether they're design variables or patient variables or surgical variables. Insofar as we can narrow that down ahead of time based on the insights we get just from looking at the registry data, right? We can get that process going much more effectively and hopefully get to answers to the pertinent questions more quickly. And I think in practice, what I would also propose is this interplay between the registry information and the in silico clinical trial. The way that we viewed it for the second case study is, right, we have the initial clinical signal, and then we're going to use the ISCT to see that signal and then add more insights. As we get more insights, right, that can prompt then looking back with the finer lens at the registry data. And perhaps there are, in fact, signals within that data that we didn't think to look at initially because of our own mental blocks, but now through the simulation, new hypotheses have emerged, and we can trace down other signals that are also based in the actual data that we have on hand. Terry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think I was doing well to let Rebecca and Alex speak before me, because this was exactly along this line. Indeed, the model can never reveal everything, but we can learn a lot from the existing model. And I'm getting old, I don't want to wait for 10, 15 years so that we are developing a very accurate model. We can learn a lot of things. We are not willing to completely replace clinical trial by in silico clinical trial. But let me comment on the applicability and practicability. Fully agree with this element. We need to have this kind of customizable model in the knee to come back to what was discussed here, and model that could be completely continuously developed. So that's typically calling for a pre-competitive co-collaboration from all the orthopedic medical device manufacturers, like you were mentioning, or can we develop some model, collaborating with academic, getting some model recognized by the regulator in such a way that we can apply that, because you make a very good point. If we decide at the last minute that we need to develop a model to use ISCT in order to address some of the points that we were unable to develop, there is no way that we can do that. It will take years. But if we have this model already available that we can just slightly customize, that's definitely something that we can do. So I'm very strongly calling for this kind of collaboration, just like we've got at the EDIT project, UK CEiRSI, and many other elements.
Thanks, Terry. That is a nice segue to when we get into the next steps here. So look forward to a little bit more ideas on that in the last 10 minutes here. Okay, so at this point, I think we're transitioning from a discussion on the second case study to just a more general discussion around the whole past hour and a half. So I invite anyone on the call to offer up new questions or comments around any of this. I'm not sure if there's anything in the chat that makes sense to bring up. If others are monitoring the chat and there's a good question, feel free to launch that up. Payman, please go ahead.
Yeah, just one quick comment, I think relates to both, is that we do have a maybe looking at this from how does this, as improving the to reduce the endpoint, to reduce maybe the clinical fracture occurrence of fractures. One thing is as this information comes back, the idea is once the information is coming back towards the development, right? For the in silico clinical trial, one thing is maybe we're missing is that which there's a precedent for that, is that we don't want to make things worse. So rather than coming from that side, from the existing precedents that, on the safety side, we are not introducing a new problem or causing additional failure, is coming from that angle. I think it reduces the load on the expectation. Just like say the worst case selection, which is from that perspective, that we are not introducing any risk from the device. coming from that angle to that to allow ISCT to take root and to become a tool, and then we'll see the benefits along that path.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. Other comments, questions? So one that I want to lob out to the group here. This whole session has been very strongly focused on clinical data, registry data specifically as a comparator. We have other clinical data sources, right? We have prospective clinical studies. We have post-market clinical follow-up that are always ongoing. We have complaints that come in to manufacturers that are more individual case studies of how things have gone. I invite the panel here. How do we combine the best of the registry source versus these other sources as well that can give us insights into what is actually happening clinically? Thoughts on that? Mark?
I would suggest that whatever we have objectivity within it, sort of baked in, if you like. So clinical trials, formal clinical trials data is obviously level 1 evidence, and you can't ignore that. And that clearly, if it's contributing any data, then that should be used. I think similarly, registry data, provided that the registry from which it is sourced has a very, very high completion rate, such as the NJ or many of the large European registries or the Australian registry, that can be that's essentially very useful because it's real world, almost complete data. I would be very hesitant about using anything that you could think of as a case report. So personal case series, I think, are completely useless as a source of data. Post-marketing surveillance data for implants, again, it really does depend on how complete that is. Because if it's incomplete, there's no point in using it, because it could be just a subset that are performing well, and therefore it could be misleading. The point is to try and avoid bias, whether that's accidental or deliberate bias. And I think similarly, complaints from patients about their implant, unless the messaging is really consistent, I think that can probably be relegated to interesting of the data, but probably not relevant for model building, unless it's revealing a really consistent problem.
Thanks, Mark. Alex, do you have a comment?
Yeah, that was really helpful, Mark. And I was, in a sense, wanted to ask the panel, and perhaps you, Mark, a question here is, and put a proposal as well forward. Do you think that there is any mileage in this question I was asking through the chat as well about, to Adrian, who is overseeing the Northwest Secure Data Environment, and they're looking. So these are not registries; these are the real, electronic health records at the regional level. But a lot of these people will have had a hip prosthesis or will have some sort of device. And the advantage is that you have a lot of longitudinal information from all of these patients, and a lot of what happened to these people even before they had a fracture and they were operated. So is there a mileage in connecting these two? And if you think that it is, would there be a possibility to, how do we come about defining what is the subset of data that is not currently in the electronic health records, but is available from the registries, that one would like the electronic health records to also include? Is there a mileage in developing like a consensus about what those variables would be, at least for a specific type of devices, hip prosthesis or other MSK devices, so that at least we create a standard about what would be the ideal scenario for those who are developing secure data environments at the moment, and may influence that availability of data in the future. Thank you.
So certainly there is a lot of mileage in linking various data sets, and what you're essentially talking about is one example of that with a regional health data environment. The problems with doing that are not so much practical as governance related. So to give you an example, the UK, we tried to link the NGL with the UK Biobank, but there were certain differences in governance procedures between the two that just made it unfeasible to proceed down that way. Now, the situation may be different with regional data sets and other electronic records. So it comes down to the governance rather than
Could you elaborate a bit, Mark, on what exactly you mean by the type of issues that can emerge? For people like me that maybe are not super experts on,
So
yeah.
You mean specifically with the UK Biobank? I can
No,
tell you
I'm thinking
in a separate email, but not
yeah.
open discussion.
I'm thinking more in terms of electronic health records in particular. So all of the patients that are in the registries had to be, admitted in a hospital to do the intervention. So there is an entry both in the hospital and in the registry, right?
Yes.
So the registry in a way, yeah.
It's just really around the logistics of the particular linkage, or rather the governance arrangements for the particular linkage and the consent, etc., etc. So the issues are not ones of practicality of actually performing the linkage. It's all around the governance of the approval to actually do it.
Other questions? Other comments?
Can I put a second one, or a third one, Jeff, about there was in the slide that you had with all the discussion points for the second study, there was, I don't know if you can put it up just to remind a bit myself as well. There was one of the points you made about blindness of comparison. And I wanted to tease out some thoughts from all of you on exactly what that means. If I understand correctly, what you mean is that there is always, you model what you understand or what you have questions about. So there is some sort of influence in that direction, right? And in that sense, it's not blind. Is that what you were trying to refer to?
Yeah, it means that, so if I come back to something Mark said about, we need to make sure that we don't have, just individual case reports or case studies. I actually think in orthopedics, a lot of the history has been around some of those case studies, right? Where we have particular small numbers of clinical observations that have been published, and then the ecosystem scrambles to come up with a test method that is predictive of that failure mode based on those small number of reports. That's not blinded, right? That's not really a bottoms up approach of we understand the patients, we understand the characteristics of the patients, we understand the use conditions of the patients, we understand how the devices perform. We're going to bring all that intelligence into a model, and we will see what emerges. And maybe we see fracture, maybe we see loosening, maybe we see stress shielding, but we don't go into that exercise with any expectations. That would be blinded. But in all of these scenarios we're thinking about, we know we have that initial signal, we have that observation, and I don't think we can credibly ignore that observation when we then come up with a modeling framework that we think is predictive of that observation.
And in which sense that is different? So I understand that, but in which sense that is different to what you have as well with a randomized control trial or any other type of a study where, to some extent, although there are aspects which you're blended, you somehow define the questions based on the understanding you have and what you want to find out. So I think I'm trying to understand how much is a problem of modeling as opposed of the fact that we only most of the times we inquire only things that we have some suspicion is the way the scientific method in a sense goes, right? You sort of have a hypothesis and then you try to test it, as opposed to pure discovery, which in a sense is more appropriate probably for things like registries, which just archive everything, or electronic health records, where we have simply no hypothesis whatsoever. We just think it's a good practice to archive all the information, and then we do statistics to pick up the signals, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with that approach, and I think in that sense it's very consistent. That we're addressing a question with an hypothesis, right? And so we're gonna choose a method that is fit for purpose. And sometimes that method might be in silico, maybe sometimes it's something else. And as you say, as you were going through it, I was thinking exactly the same thing, that the registry is the opposite, right? That there's no hypothesis, I think, behind that, other than maybe that this is okay. Mark, I think Mark may disagree on this one, but it's really it's a data exploration. So let's gather a lot of data that we think are relevant, but we may see new failure modes emerge, right? We may see new clinical signals emerge that don't come because we have a specific hypothesis. Mark, go ahead.
I was actually agreeing. I was just saying, I was shaking my head to say, no, it is correct that that registries are not hypothesis solving, they're observational data that are hypothesis generating. So full agreement.
Okay, good. I feel better then. Mike?
Yeah, I think just as I mean, this is slightly off topic slightly off topic. It's still related, but it'd be interesting to know what both of your thoughts are, Jeff and Mark, with relation to this. But do you think there's enough granularity in what's reported in the joint registry figures from an engineering perspective when it comes to relating that to failure, or do we need to be collecting more information that could provide clear linkage between? Now, I'm coming at it from an engineering perspective, but the implant and I guess the whole surgeon implant patient factors, but particularly to the design of and function of the device.
So I can perhaps come back on this one with a slight rap on the knuckles to industry, because there is a highly granular, highly detailed implant component database that was introduced probably about 7 or 8 years ago that goes down to exactly what the surface roughness of the surface coating is on a particular place on the implant stem, for example. It is a complete classifier of all implant details. This is in operation. However, depending upon the manufacturer, and some are more on the naughty step than others, this component database is currently incompletely populated by industry. It's completely available within the registries, and it just needs properly and completely filling in by industry, and to enable you to do all sorts of detail. You might say, does this stem, is it more likely to get loose because of this particular surface roughness versus a different one, or this particular stem geometry, or this particular trunnion characteristic? So all of that all of that data should in principle be available. It just needs completing. And that's not a registry problem, that's an industry problem.
And Mike, I would say in answer to your question, I think both are true. I do believe finally going through this thought experiment, absolutely we should be able to show agreement with registry information that we can, we should, we ought to. And yes, there are assumptions in there, but we need to wrestle with those uncertainties, because that is the clinical reality. And if there are Yeah, we have to. And I think if in the case study 2 that for example Steve was talking about, where we have a couple root causes that we're hypothesizing for loosening, and if we're able to come up with a method, in this case a computational method, but a method that correctly shows that the trends in terms of some things that we can directly compare with the registry, such as potentially patient characteristics or gender or things like this, and others that we may not be able to in terms of posterior slope or things like this. If we have agreement with the data that we have, we could, we should, we ought to use that to good end to further understand the problem. So I do believe in that. That was the bias that I put out at the start of this. At the same time, I would argue as well that the data really are insufficient. That the more that we can tighten those uncertainties, the more that we can struggle with and solve the governance issues that Mark was mentioning about bringing in different types of data to allow more patient specificity to the approach rather than just living in the population domain. We learn more, we understand more, and we can use that more to good end. So to me, it's yes and yes.
Yeah, but it's getting that linkage, isn't it, all the way through? I think that's really important because I mean, Mark spoke about the inputs there, what the inputs into patients in terms of like what surface roughnesses, geometries that's coming out. There's also a bit of a critique there as well about actually individual case studies or low numbers, which to a certain extent is what we get with some of the retrieval studies. Which kind of muddies the water to a certain extent. But really what we need is that whole kind of that loop being closed to a certain extent, where we can have we have a clear linkage between the device population that it's going in, the outputs, and then the in the middle bit, which I guess is a registries to a certain extent.
All right, one final comment from Alex, and then I will share the proposal that this group came up with as a parting shot for this seminar. Alex.
Yeah, maybe just sorry. I know that I asked this before and I got very good answers, but I just, based on everything you're saying, I still believe that if we could have a list of what you have in a registry that is not in an electronic health record by default, the community would make a lot more impact by working with the NHS to ensure that the registry additional information is recorded for every patient than trying to have completion on the registries, which is kind of on the side type of database. And you will get by default continuity, along the life course of that patient, and you will get registries pretty much for every type of device, because ultimately we are talking about NGO, but then this is probably the jewel of the crown, right, in terms of registries. If you then go to cardiac, NICOR is the second largest perhaps in the country, and then which is not the same quality, and probably there is very little more to go. So it's I want to suggest that if there is a way to create that list of additional pieces of information that you miss in a regular electronic health record, there are people in the community that could help to influence whether that gets adopted or not, and I would be very keen to hear from a group of experts what those variables could look like, or we can take that offline, of course. Thank you.
I think we take that one offline, and I'm thinking maybe that's another entry point that could go into the proposal for the next steps. So I need to think a little bit more about that. Okay, so great discussion. We don't want to stop here. So this whole pilot was around some thought experiments. There were no simulations being done. There were no studies being conducted. It was really a thought experiment. But speaking on my own behalf, but I think also the tone of the group, we very much want to continue with this. I think this is a very relevant case study, and we see a very clear way where the CEiRSI can help to advance this into not just a thought experiment, but providing real resources, real intelligence, real mechanisms to enable us to do exactly what we talked about in these case studies. So as a proposed next phase, what we would like to see is that the CEiRSI develop a data access infrastructure and real simulation testbed for evaluating one or several systems in the NGR using the simulation results to predict outcomes across the population. Do what it is that we laid out here. So what does that mean in practice? One is, let's come up with a public data set of anatomical models for both knees and hips. We have a lot of data out there. Individual companies have data, academic groups have data. Let's come up with a common public data set of models that are benchmarked against the registry so that we really know the legitimacy of using that virtual population as a surrogate for the NJR. Extract and make accessible detailed performance data from the registry. Imaging maybe is a dream right now, but that's certainly something that all of us see as very important beyond the metadata that we get from the registry right now. And then also enable access to hardware and software to members for specific analysis intentions. So could the CEiRSI invest to make these sorts of things available to the community? If they can, then what happens? So thinking about myself as an industry partner, thinking about academic partners who are interested in doing some of the technical work here, we can all bring in our designs. Some of these will be proprietary. We have to respect that, but we can bring them in and evaluate them using center resources, using the models, using the software, using the hardware, and develop some of the workflows. This isn't with the idea to come up with, this is a singular approach for evaluating loosening in knees. The goal is not to come up with, this is the singular approach to evaluate periprosthetic fracture in hips. I think we are too early on that, but enable individual groups to come in with their individual approaches on a common data set, on their own designs, to start to ferret out what are the appropriate methods to start to align predictions with registry results. And then anyone who participates in this, we commit to public dissemination of results around model credibility. That elevates everyone in the space, right? So if I'm evaluating my system and I show good results relative to registry, so credible results, and others from competitors do the same thing, right? Everyone, I think, would feel better that we have a general good mechanistic understanding of these types of failure modes. We don't necessarily share the proprietary results, but I can certainly imagine ways to share pre-competitive results in this space where we're trying to develop and validate baseline modeling approaches. And then that also introduces a key value proposition. So I know this is something front and center for me and many others on this call. What do we get from this? Well, there's access to the data, to the hardware, to the software. There's a collaboration with all the partners as well as the regulators as we are trying to achieve what is finally a model that is good enough, right? Credible enough. We have voices from a lot of different constituents to weigh in on whether we've gotten that. And then once we're there, then we have the opportunity to deploy the resources and tools to support more specific activities as individual partners want to do. So this is kind of a rough skeleton, but we'll toss that out for consideration because I think, again, speaking on behalf of myself only, very much interested in doing this. I think this connection absolutely should be made, has to be made, and it's only with these connections that we're able to really tease out the corners of performance now, which is where we can make better, achieve better outcomes for those patients. Mark?
So from the NJR's perspective, I completely agree. In fact, we're developing a whole new strand within the NJR structure, which is an ongoing process around digital and actually AI as well. But and so these kind of in silico models and this concept that we can shorten the time for the development and evaluation of prosthesis by taking out the low-hanging fruit that we know isn't going to work early on. It is part of the core mission of NJR. So if we can help perpetuate the CEiRSI initiative into the next and through the next grant application to success, we'd be very much interested in contributing.
All right. Thanks, Mark. So with that, I think we are at the top of the hour. So thanks to everyone for the participation. A special thanks to Mark and Steve. You both shared some of the heavy lifting for the presentation today, and also the prep work that led into this. Appreciate all the support from those on this group, and happy to keep this going. Alex, Laura, any closing thoughts before we end?
Maybe
Any
just.
announcements?
Yeah, maybe if just Laura wants to, as she usually does, to remind us of the next meeting.
Yep, so our next meeting will be taking place on the 9th of July at same time, 2 to 4 p.m. And it'll be on TAVI implantation and the creation of conditional generative virtual populations for targeted in silico trials. Thank you.
Super. And also stay tuned. There is going to be on the 9th of July a webinar. So this is a pilot, what Lara just updated, but there will be also a webinar on the 9th of July where we are bringing a number of colleagues from philosophy of science and a number of modelers looking into the epistemics of modeling and basically what is a measurement and what's simulation in essence, and how we distinguish them, and try to look at this from a very different angle that we normally do as technologists. Thank you.